reviewed the code with the Department of Justice, Federal Department of Justice. We went back and forth quite a bit on some of the alternatives we had in place. They insisted on certain amendments, which we made, and then at the completion of that process, the Department of Justice certified certain portions of the California Historic Building Code section on accessibility as being in compliance with ADA, and I'll talk about that as we go through the slides. So this is the old set of sections that were included in the chapters 8-6 before we went through it with Department of Justice. And you'll see some of these are still in place. Purpose and intent, scope, basic provisions, and alternatives. The alternatives were altered a little bit with the Department of Justice. Section 8-604, which is equivalent facilitation, is still in there, but it has not been certified as meeting the requirements of ADA by the Department of Justice, because it's basically saying you can't come up with an equivalent level of equivalent facilitation. It becomes a matter to discuss between the person doing the, who's proposing the equivalency, and whoever at at the level of DOJ, or what I'm thinking, I'm losing my letters. Anyway, whoever the party is that is making the judgment as to whether or not it meets code, there's a tug of war that goes on there before you come up with an equivalent facilitation. And we'll talk about it a little bit. I think Don's going to talk about it more. And finally, there was a section that says here equivalent facilitation, but it actually was exemptions. So the slide is wrong. There was an exemption. There was a basis for coming up with an exemption. The Department of Justice essentially would not allow that to be in the code, so it was taken out. So let's talk a little bit about the purpose and intent, which is somewhat parallel to what we've seen in the administration chapter, but it's slightly different. So it does say that under the purpose, the local jurisdiction is required to accept reasonably equivalent alternatives to regular code, and that the intent is to preserve the integrity of the qualified historic building while providing access and use by persons with disabilities. It goes on to state, I'm going to skip a slide here and then go back to it, that if it is all possible to comply with regular code and or the rules of ADA, it shall be applied. And that is unless you can show that strict compliance with the ADA and the prevailing code will threaten or destroy historical significance or character defining features. So that is not stated in all other chapters of the CHBC, but it is in the ADA chapter. So the scope, the regulations apply to every qualified historic building that's required to provide access. This is another change from what you would see in the administration chapter, where in the administration chapter it applied to rehabilitation, adaptive reuse, repairs, and reconstruction of historic buildings. In this case, if you relocate or reconstruct a building, here it's called reconstruction / replicas of historic buildings, you do not get out of compliance with full compliance with the ADA. It's assuming the work of moving or reconstructing a building, your design can be adapted to comply with ADA. So that was the area that covers how you would go about doing performance-based and alternatives. The code does have some provisions that are specifically allowed. Again, when the historical significance or character defining features are threatened, you can use these alternative procedures. Otherwise, they're going to require that you stick with the compliance with ADA. Um, and they also state that the provisions that are shown in the accessibility chapter only be applied on a case by case basis, and that you provide documentation, as Cindy was talking about earlier. When you're doing you making any alternative, using any alternatives to meet the requirements of regular code, or provide reasonable safety, she thinks it's a very good idea that that a building official documents that. So when somebody comes back and asks how this was allowed, they've got documentation that shows how they got there. It is doubly important with accessibility, because we know that it's an area where you're more likely to see lawsuits than you might in other areas of the code, and so you have to document how you got to where you got to. This is a paragraph that was added by the Department of Justice, and it states where you can find a basis for developing alternative minimum standards, and it directs you to section 4.1.73 of the ADA Standards for Accessible Design, as incorporated and set forth in Federal Regulations 28C.F.RPT 36. I followed that line, and it takes you to, I should have written it down. Here it is. It takes you to subpart D, if I remember correctly. And what it states is that alterations to buildings or facilities that are eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places under the National Historic Preservation Act, or are designed or designated as historic under state or local law, shall comply to the maximum extent feasible with this part. So that addresses historic buildings and gives them a little bit of leeway. If it's determined that it is not feasible to provide physical access to the historic property as a place of public accommodation in a manner that will not threaten or destroy historic significance of the building or the facility, alternative methods of access shall be provided pursuant to requirements of subpart C. I then followed this to subpart C, and what I saw that subpart C is basically guidance on the application of all of the statute to specific situations. So there is additional guidance that is provided through the CHBC that takes you to the ADA standards and guidelines. Oops. This is changing direction. Sorry. So here are some of the alternates and the way they're stated in the code. We see a lot of historic buildings, and Cindy showed you a couple where you've got a grand staircase that leads up to the main entry. And that grand staircase is usually on the front of the building, which is usually the most significant part of the building, certainly very, character defining and so forth. So it's been recognized that that's an issue, and trying to get a ramp up to that front entry may be a very difficult problem without destroying the actual appearance of the building that you're trying to get access to. So access to any entrance used by the general public, which is a very strong part of this sentence, and no further than 200 feet away from the primary entrance may be used. I didn't bring a case study on this, but we have had situations like on a large main library in a Bay Area city, where we had that situation with like a staircase that was probably 10 to 15 steps up to the main entrance. The only way we were actually going to get somebody in there is by building some sort of a structure on the back of this building that would allow access to the upper floors. We had to put an elevator in as well, and again shows the back of the building to do that. What we realized as we were designing this is we were designing a new entrance. So it did not get built, but by the time we got through with the design drawings, what we had done is we had shifted the main entrance of the building to this location in the back. It became the new lobby. It had a stair, it had elevators, it had restrooms, and it became the place where the entire public would enter. So in some cases, what you can do is you can alter the function of the building to more closely comply with what 80A would like you to do. And actually, we were actually, by changing the main entrance, able to bring the disabled accessible entrance into the same entrance as the main entrance of the building. Yeah, it's poorly written. It's not the way it's interpreted. The interpretation is path of travel. And, so I'll put another note in the code that we need to change that. Yeah, but it's treated as path of travel. Yeah. The secondary, or the second in priority, in terms of what you could do for an entrance, a disabled access entrance, is use an entrance that's not generally used by the public, or not used by the general public. Open, unlock directional signs at the primary entrance and as close as possible to, but no further away than the 200 feet that are designated in the first of the alternatives. This is not used very often because it's still perceived as being a secondary entrance, and really our goal in trying to provide accessibility is some sense of dignity, and not where you might have to call somebody for help or something along those lines. And finally, the last alternative, but it is allowed, is an accessible entrance with a notification system where it's not open all the time, but you would have to actually press a buzzer to get somebody there to open the door to let you in. And again, it's not a preferred alternative, but it is allowed if the other alternatives are not available. This is a case study involving the University of California Men's Faculty Club. And if you're not familiar with the University of California campus, it's very hilly. In this area, this little spot looks flat, but frankly, there's hills to the right, there's hills up behind it, and it's very difficult to get to. It's a Mabec building that was altered by a series of actually very prominent architects. It grew sort of like Topsy, and so the access is very difficult. This is the plan of the ground floor, and as you can see, it's very complicated. The wings at the north were added at a different time. The wings to the southeast were added at a different time, and the wing on the west was added at a different time. So this is the main entrance to the area where the reception desk is located, and obviously needed to be considered primary access. And there were ramps that were built into the landscape to at least get to the adjacent pathways. This is the entrance itself. And we were fine getting into the building at that point for the ground floor, except that once you get inside, you see that arrow pointing at a set of stairs, because the ground floor is on two distinct levels. That's what the stairs look like. The stairs were considered a character-defining feature built during the period of significance. So we started looking for an alternative way to get onto that floor. By the way, the jurisdiction, the AHJ in this case was the Department of the State Architect, and they have an access group that looked at these, our proposals and vetted them. So we looked around for the closest adjacent entry that got you into the level of the second floor above the entry level, and those pathways were designed in the landscape so that by leaving the entry there and doing a little zigzag, it got you up to the level of the secondary, the secondary level in the first floor. And we had an entrance that was accessible by a pathway. It happened to be an existing pathway and level enough from the main entrance to this entry right here. The entry was compliant, and so we got onto that second floor higher first floor level by that access point. So it got you from what was the reception area for the hotel rooms to the level where most of the meeting rooms are, and also the main lunchroom.
Know if everybody can hear me. There's a truck outside. I don't know if anybody here is from McDonald, J.A. McDonald, that's parked in a place that needs to be moved. So if anybody in here, I didn't think it would be, but I told them I'd make the announcement.
Okay. So to further complicate things, this is the second floor. The second floor is separately accessible from 3 different stairways from the main floor. You can't get to everywhere on the second floor from any one place on the first floor. In addition, there was no place that it seemed reasonable to try to locate an elevator. So we looked at the fact that we do have a significant slope up from, but on a very long pathway up from the reception area to the entry, from there up to here. This is actually an entrance to the second floor, and there's a porch there, and that's covered. So in order to get to the room that you see by the dotted line is designated as the the only disabled accessible room that was required because they have very few residential units there. This was the path of travel that was chosen. The porch was altered. As you can see to the left, a ramp was added. And the direction of the ramp was basically to an area that was level enough that you could actually gain access to that point. We had to make some changes to the porch in order to raise it so that it was a level entry. Then it was pretty much leveling from there and met the requirements of the ADA for getting access to that room. We did actually alter the room as well, but I won't go into that. This is a site plan. To the upper right, you can see the entry with the zigzag. That's a line of travel from the entry, which was where the reception desk is, which is where you would probably check in if you're going to be staying in a room on the second floor, with the pathway that leads you to the entrance to the second floor. And then from that point, an access to the only parking area that was anywhere near the building. There's very, very limited vehicle access on the University of California, and there was no other parking area even close to the building. So what we did was we actually did grading work on that parking area in order to create an accessible path of travel from a parking space that's an accessible parking space, actually van accessible, to the second floor entry, and from that point also all the way down to the reception area. Not an ideal solution, but the Department of the State Architect did vet it and approve it, and it was constructed by the faculty. The point being that that the simplicity of the provisions that are given as alternatives in the CHBC don't really give you the direction on how to meet the requirements of a specific location. So there's a good deal of creativity involved, and certainly vetting by whatever the local jurisdiction is that's actually reviewing for ADA compliance. Doors. This is a very bizarre collection of alternatives, but the DOJ insisted on this configuration remaining. This is it's an old oddity, but it still remains. So, in order of priority, single-leaf doors, which are allowed, are doors that provide a 30-inch clear opening instead of a 32-inch, which is required by ADA, or a secondary, a single-leaf door, which provides a minimum of 29.5 inches clear opening. Now, remember, we're talking about historic buildings here, so we're not saying, well, look, I want to build a 29.5-inch door, but I'm required first priority to build a 30-inch door. You're not building doors. In fact, if you were building a new door, it would have to comply with the 32-inch requirement of ADA. So the fact that there are two choices here is meaningless. What they're saying is the minimum you can use is an existing clearance of 29.5 inches. There used to be one that was taken out by DOJ that was 28.5 inches The value in that was 28.5-inch clearance is what you could usually get from a 90-degree opening of a 30-inch door. And there are a lot of 30-inch doors that occur in historic buildings. But they did not allow that to remain. So the real thrust of this is that you can get down as small, as narrow as a 29.5-inch clear opening in a historic door, and keep that door in use. There are tricks that are done. There are Parliament hinges, and offset hinges, and ways of getting the door to open more fully. But in general, this is still the number you're trying to hit if you're using the CHBC for accessibility. There's a couple other alternatives that are provided. I don't know why a double door with one leaf at 29.5 inches is a lower priority than a single leaf door, but it is the next step down. And finally, double doors, and frankly, single door this would be true of as well if you needed it. The power assist device to provide a minimum opening of 29.5 inches. So then that would work, and it worked on the faculty club where you had essentially not French doors but French windows that were really designed in the old style. And the pair together, no single leaf was going to give you the access you needed, but the pair together would. So this is about power-assisted doors in general, and you see power-assisted doors used a lot for accessibility compliance, and the reason is there are a myriad of things that existing buildings requirements that existing buildings have a difficult time meeting. So level landings, we often have sloped walkways coming up to an entry. Strike side clearance, which is often an issue if the door is swinging towards you, a space for you to get out of the way of the door as you're opening it. And the fact that the door is too heavy to meet the requirements of ADA in terms of what it takes to open that door. And so the power assist is used often to meet the requirements of the ADA without actually having the doorway meet the requirements. Toilet rooms, this is used fairly often in lieu of separate gender toilet facilities as required in regular code. An accessible unisex toilet facility may be designated, and that has been used a number of times where you have two small restrooms that are neither of them are adequate for ADA compliance, and there is no place to expand those restrooms, so those two restrooms can be combined into a single unisex restroom to meet the requirements of ADA. Ramps and lifts. This is, again, oddly worded, but a lift is allowed as an alternative for getting you from one level to another level, say from a walkway to a porch, which would then have accessibility to a doorway. They also, the code also allows a ramp greater than standard slope, which would be 1 in 12, but no greater than 1 in 10 for distances not to exceed 5 feet. So that gives you a little relief in a situation where you haven't got the room to actually use a complying ramp. And again, I would stress that it's where you don't have the capacity to provide a compliant ramp, then you would provide something like this. And again, signs need to be posted to make sure people are aware that it's steeper than normal. And finally, access by ramps of 1 in 6 slope for horizontal distance not to exceed 13 inches. And again, signs posted. Now, and that 13 inches was determined on the basis of the wheelbase of a wheelchair, and the idea would be to not have both sets of wheels on a steeply sloped ramp at the same time. And that number 13, or the distance 13, was developed actually by the State Department of Rehabilitation. There is another alternative provided in ADA, which is for 2 feet, and Donnie, help me here, but I think it allows a slope of 1 in 8 or something. Yep, no idea. All right. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, no, I know 1 to 12, but there's a provision in ADA, I think specifically for existing buildings that allows something like 1 in 8. I'm not. Don't quote me. It may be 1 in 12. I mean 1 in 10 also, but somewhere in there that allows it for 8 feet. Um, yeah. 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 It could be. It could be. Um, this is the area of equipment facilitation. There's really not much to say about it, because what we're talking about is it sort of it bounces around a little bit. It talks about it has this statement which says basically that deviation from particular technical and scoping requirements are permitted if the application of the alternative provisions contained in section 8-603 would threaten or destroy and I think would threaten or destroy the historical significance or character defining features of the qualified historical building or property. So it's basically setting um, the stage for an alternative to be developed that would somehow be shown to provide equivalent facilitation or an alternative that would get you where you want to go. Um, Again, such alternatives can only be applied on an item by item basis. And then what it starts to do is it starts to talk more about virtual reality as opposed to actually getting you into the building. So I've seen this section used both ways, both as a way to develop alternatives that get you into the building and a way of developing something else like, some kind of video type show, some kind of movement around of offices, so that offices that are available only on the second floor are now available on the first floor, or services of any kind. Um, this is access provided by experiences, services, functions, materials, and resources through methods including but not limited to maps, plans, videos, virtual reality, and related equipment at accessible levels. Um, the alternative design and/or technologies used will provide substantially equivalent or greater accessibility to and usability of the facility. Um, the most important part of this, and I didn't list the whole long paragraph, which is something like this, is that the official in charge with enforcement of the standards shall document the reasons that it was approved. And it goes into great detail as to the level of documentation that is required and the way that it needs to be maintained. This is a situation, where everyone is probably going to feel a little hung out there, and so the documentation has to be there to support the reason that the decision was made. I think that's pretty much it. This is it. This is a nice additional paragraph that was added, or sentence that was added by Department of Justice. Equivalent facilitation for an element of a building or property when applied as a waiver of an ADA accessibility requirement will not be entitled to the Federal Department of Justice certification of this code as rebuttable evidence of compliance for that element. So they've backed away from equivalent facilitation as something that they can support. This is a couple of quick case studies. How am I doing on time? Okay, well, this is very quick. This is a building that was destroyed in a fire and rebuilt. So, given the fact that it was rebuilt, this is the old Hall High School auditorium. Given the fact that it was destroyed and it had to be rebuilt, ADA came into play. The issue on this was that it was a steeply sloped floor that provided racked seating. And what we need to do is provide access, which is generally supposed to be spread throughout a facility. In this case, building department was comfortable with the idea of getting people on a ramp up to the upper level and taking some seats out to allow for wheelchair seating and access to the lower level, where again there was some seats taken out that would allow wheelchair seating in that area. This gets into the next chapter. I don't know if Laura's here yet, but the fellow with the white hair is her colleague, and we're doing a tour there of Battery Chamberlain at Baker Beach, and that metal structure on the concrete embankment is actually a disappearing gun, and it actually comes up to fire and drops down into a pit to disappear when it's not being used, so to protect it. That was one where the Park Service had to their AHJ had to come to the determination that trying to get a wheelchair or somebody who is disabled up onto that upper ramp, which is what they allow, could not be accomplished without essentially destroying the facility. So they developed a programmatic equivalent facilitation for the presentation of the tour of this facility. That's pretty much it. Questions?
Any questions?
Oh, good.
You must have covered it really well.
Yeah, where else?
Thanks, Helen. Helen, would you like to introduce the next speaker?
I would like to introduce Dawn Anderson, who is the principal of As It Stands architectural firm, which specializes in universal